Imagine you're reading the Three Musketeers, the swashbuckling duels, the daring midnight rides, the dashing young hero with a talent for surviving absurd odds. But behind all of that gallantry, the real battle was won by a priest in a red robe, armed with paperwork, patience, and a truly villainous understanding of logistics. Behind Alexander Dumas' romanticized sword fights, there were muddy trenches, collapsing ladders, and one very determined cardinal. While our D'Artagnan was busy fighting mysterious assassins, Cardinal Richelieu was playing the long game. The really long game. Turning a war of muskets into a masterclass in strategy. It is every bit as dramatic, just with fewer capes with more dysentery. And one of Europe's most impregnable cities learned the hard way that no wall is safe from a man armed with ambition and a fondness for sinking ships. In Dumas' novel, the whole affair of the Siege of La Rochelle is rather briskly dispatched. After the business with the Queen's diamond necklace, our hero D'Artagnan rides off to La Rochelle with his Three Musketeer friends. The Huguenots, backed by England's Duke of Buckingham, have holed up inside the city, and the King's Musketeers are sent to drive the English away and take the place by storm. And that's where the story flips. Until this point, the Duke of Buckingham, elegant, romantic, a bit too fond of the Queen's jewels, had been on the same side as your heroes. And suddenly he becomes the enemy, invading France itself. Meanwhile, the ever-scheming Cardinal Richelieu, who had made a career of ruining everyone's day, finds himself on the same team as the Musketeers. D'Artagnan fights bravely, Richelieu notices him, and voila, the young man becomes a proper musketeer. And that's about it. Dumas, ever the dramatist, doesn't linger on mud, disease, or the endless business of digging trenches. D'Artagnan spends more time dueling mysterious assassins than facing cannon fire. But there's a reason for that omission. You see, this was not a war of individual heroics. It was a contest of minds, not swords. La Rochelle, perched on France's western coast, was one of the kingdom's busiest ports. Prosperous and proudly Protestant, it thrived on trade, both domestic and international, and boasted a sophisticated shipping industry. And with prosperity, of course, came taxes. Capturing the city meant not only strategic control, but also substantial tax revenue. Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu had every reason to want this autonomous city under their direct authority. But there was one problem. La Rochelle had a reputation for being impregnable. For decades, no Catholic army had managed to take it. Its Huguenot citizens were supremely confident that even Richelieu, with all his cunning and the king's backing, would not be able to breach their walls. And the Huguenots had not risen against Louis XIII on a whim. They had a prior agreement with Buckingham, who had promised full English support. And in July 1627, the Duke actually made good on his word. A fleet of 100 ships and some 7,000 men appeared off the coast of La Rochelle. One can imagine the cheers inside the city and the grim faces in Richelieu's camp outside. Yet Buckingham, in his usual fashion, chose style over substance. Instead of sailing directly into La Rochelle's harbor, he decided to capture a nearby island, Île de Ré, and turn it into an English base. From there, his navy could dominate the water, keep the French bottled up, and send supplies into the besieged city. If he succeeds, Richelieu's whole campaign would collapse before it even began. So this island became the first battleground for the two great forces. Buckingham ordered a full-scale assault. The local French garrison tried to repel the English landing, but was forced back into a small fortress of Île de Ré. It wasn't large, but it was well built. Retreating into the fortress, the French commander Marquis de Troyes cleverly gathered all the island's food supplies, leaving Buckingham's troops with plenty of sand but not much supper. And that wasn't the Duke's only problem. His chief siege engineer, the only man who truly knew how to reduce a fortress, was shot dead during the landing. That left Buckingham with a castle to storm and no idea how to do it. His cannons were too small to make a dent in the stone walls, and his scaling ladders, when tested, reached only halfway up. And if that sounds like a farce, it rather was. Imagine an army lugging ladders across a beach, finding that they don't fit, and then holding a meeting about it. Desperate, Buckingham sent 4 reinforcements. Fresh Irish troops and some food arrived, but the ship carrying his heavier artillery and siege equipment, the very tools he needed, sank in a storm before reaching the island. And so the proud Duke of Buckingham, favorite of the English court and supposed rival to Richelieu, found himself pacing the beach on Île de Ré, staring at a fortress he couldn't take while the French inside calmly ate his dinner. And at this point, the Duke of Buckingham had run out of clever ideas, and more importantly, of siege equipment. The only strategy left was to surround the fortress of Île de Ré, seal it tight, and wait for hunger to do what his cannons could not. Everything now hinged on one question. Could the French resupply the fortress by sea, or would the English blockade starve it into submission? Inside Saint-Martin, the Marquis de Troyes was holding firm, but his garrison's food stores were dwindling fast. He sent word to the mainland begging for help. The problem was that the English fleet dominated the surrounding water. Breaking through that blockade looked about as likely as rowing through a brick wall. Cardinal Richelieu, never one to accept impossible as an answer, gathered his naval captains. He laid out the situation, and then the incentive. Whoever could break the English line and deliver supplies to Troyes would receive a reward beyond imagining. The win the lottery and retire forever kind of money. But still, all the money in the world is no good if you don't survive. The English fleet was waiting, guns loaded, in open water. Sailing into that was, by any sensible measure, suicide. So the captains naturally hesitated. They muttered, shuffled their feet, and looked at the floor. But then one man, whose name is lost to history, but no doubt with nerves of steel and perhaps a touch of lunacy, volunteered. He set out under cover of darkness, slipped between the English ships, and somehow, miraculously, reached the fortress. Even more astonishing, he got out again alive. Richelieu was delighted. He summoned all the captains again, and in front of everyone, praised this man's courage and handed him 30,000 livres in gold right there and then. Now this was a sum so large it could have bought him an estate and a lifetime of fine wines, and then some for his heirs too. And just like that, every other captain in the fleet discovered a sudden passion for daring night runs. Gold, it seemed, had a marvelous way of curing fear, even of English cannon. And so, in October 1627, the counterattack was in full swing. Richelieu's gamble had paid off at sea. 35 ships set out in the night. 6 ships were lost in the fighting, but 29 slipped through and reached the harbor of Saint-Martin with supplies and reinforcements. For the starving garrison at Saint-Martin, it was a miraculous rescue. The place came back to life. Food arrived. Spirits rose. The English, on the other hand, lost heart. And never to miss a chance, Cardinal Richelieu put 4,000 men ashore. And then another help arrived. Disease. Cold and sickness did for the English what Troyes' guts and Richelieu's planning could not do alone. Pressure from the French army ashore finished the job. The English fled north. Their losses were dreadful. Of some 7,000 men who had landed, as many as 5,000 perished. Buckingham's failure at Île de Ré was only the first stage for Richelieu's siege of La Rochelle. The city's defenses were a marshy, waterlogged nightmare for any attacker. Deep ditches, wet ground, and strong walls made a frontal assault costly and foolish. Richelieu knew that, if the city was to fall, it would be by blockade and engineering, not by cavalry charges and heroics. So he set about strangling La Rochelle by land. His men built forts in a tight ring. They closed every road. They sealed the approaches. They left not even the smallest gap through which even an ant could crawl. The cordon they created stretched for a vast distance, roughly 12 kilometers, and it was built with a precision that would have made any modern project manager weep with envy. But the sea remained the problem. The French navy was comparatively small. How could they stop the much larger English fleet bringing supplies into the harbor? Richelieu had an Italian engineer in his pay, Pompeo Targone. Targone suggested a bold idea: build a breakwater, block the channel, and close off the harbor. The mouth of the bay was about 1.4 kilometers across. It was a vast undertaking, and many thought it impossible. 4,000 laborers were set to work. They moved stone, timber, sand, everything that they could keep water where it belonged. And for a moment, success seemed within reach. The two halves of the mole were joined. Joy, drums, perhaps a little dancing on the ramparts. Then a storm came. A great wave tore out the middle section, and the English supply runs resumed. This defeat could have ended the siege. But Richelieu did not give up. He brought in an architect, Clément Mitezeau. Mitezeau had a simple, practical mind and a stubborn streak. He examined the wrecked mole and found the reason it failed. The center portion was exposed to a concentrated force of surf. Pouring more loose stones would be just to feed it. Mitezeau proposed something sturdier. His solution? Unconventional. Sink ships, fill them with rubble and sink them at the channel's mouth. The hulks would form a solid foundation for them all. They would blunt the force of waves and hold the infill in place. It sounds delightfully unromantic, and it was, but it worked. The sunken vessels, combined with timber chevrons and wooden superstructure facing the sea, stabilized the work. Heavy, long-range guns were mounted along the completed mole. And from that vantage point, the French could fend off any approaching English ship. By March of 1628, La Rochelle was sealed tighter than a banker's vault. Richelieu had achieved what every administrator dreams of: total control, down to the last fishing boat. Nothing got in or out. No bread, no bullets, no English optimism. England did send help. Twice, actually. But when their ships saw the line of French cannons on Richelieu's new seawall pointed at them, they thought better of it and sailed home. And after that, everyone in La Rochelle knew there would be no rescue. The Huguenots were left with no hope. Disease had swept through the city again and again, trimming the population from 30,000 souls to barely 5,000. By the time the proud and stubborn Huguenots finally surrendered, they had no more cards left to play. Their autonomous city vanished, along with its trade privileges and its small but cherished army. The only thing that still remained to them was the guarantee of Edict de Nantes, freedom of religion, in theory at least. Thus ended the siege of La Rochelle, one of the grand spectacles of early 17th century France. The outcome was one-sided. The royal army triumphed over the Huguenots, France triumphed over England, and Cardinal Richelieu triumphed over the Duke of Buckingham. No one had expected such an overwhelming victory from the bookish cardinal in the red robes, but he passed his first great test with flying colors. This success cemented Richelieu's authority. The Huguenot's fears, mind you, were not misplaced. Richelieu had always sworn to uphold the Edict of Nantes, and he did. But centralization is a hungry thing. It eats local rights for breakfast. Once the royal authority became absolute, who could guarantee the next monarch would be as reasonable as Richelieu? Huguenot's last fortress has fallen, and their self-rule gone. They were left to the ruler's mercy, and that, in 17th century France or in 21st century, is never a restful position. What about the man who was on the losing side of the battle, the Duke of Buckingham? When he came back to England, the country mocked and blamed him. Still, King Charles I defended his favorite and promised more support, and that only served to further inflame the public anger. And we will see what happened to him in our next video. So please like and subscribe to continue receiving the stories from history. And leave your thoughts and suggestions in comments. Also, check out our other videos for the stories from other countries and periods. It really helps a small channel like us.